Alright, so in this video we are going to look at the emergence of Russia. Last video we saw the emergence of Prussia, which eventually will evolve into Germany, and the emergence of Austria. Now we have Russia, another country that will play a vital role in modern history. World War One, and World War Two, and the Communist Revolution, and the Cold War. Now Russia itself has a very turbulent history, a very violent history in its beginning. It started off relatively small, focused on the modern city of Moscow. And it's not really until Ivan the Fourth, right, that Russia begins to emerge as a true political force. And Ivan IV, you can see him on the screen there. He's probably more famous by his nickname Ivan the Terrible, which is a nickname that he promoted, that he enjoyed, that he liked. If you remember, Machiavelli said if a ruler had to pick between being loved or being feared, he should pick feared. Now, I don't know if Ivan ever read The Prince. I kind of doubt it, right? But he definitely lived out that line of being feared. Right? And much like Louis the 14th in France, his childhood and growing up will be scarred by political drama, even murder, which we'll talk about in just a second. So Ivan the Fourth, he's the first Russian ruler to officially use the title Tsar. That's the Russian word for Caesar, and that's not an accident. So Ivan and the czars after him are linking themselves to the great Caesars of the past, like Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, right? And just like in France, how there's often tension between the nobility and the king of France, in Russia, there's often tension between the Tsar and the Russian nobility called the boyars. In fact, when Ivan was growing up, he witnessed some of his own family members murdered in front of him at the hands of rebellious boyars. So as you can imagine, he will not trust the boyars. He will not like the boyars. He will spend his reign taking as much power away from the boyars as possible, just like Louis the 14th. A big difference is Ivan the Fourth uses violence more than, let's say, manipulation like Louis the 14th does. Hence the nickname Ivan the Terrible. And so he's a complicated figure in Russia. Some Russian circles, he's viewed as a hero, as the founder of modern Russia, but in others as like a villain. He was terrible. He did terrible things. He did use violence to get his way, but at the same time, he tried to bring more learning to Russia. He had a gigantic library, which ironically enough has went missing. It's one of the great lost treasures of the world. Where did his library go? For us book nerds, it's a huge deal. Anyway, a complicated figure nonetheless. He even created what we would call a secret police. So a secret police, the job is not to keep secrets, but the job is not to go after regular criminals like robbers, right? And the job of secret police is to go after anyone who doesn't support the government and eliminate them. And so he had this secret police throughout his kingdom. And if you crossed him, he would have you killed. He would not hesitate to do so. But his own temper is going to be a problem. One night at dinner, you had Ivan's son, and Ivan's daughter-in-law and guests eating dinner, and Ivan criticized his son's wife and said she was dressed inappropriately, but he said it in front of the entire guests, and he said it in a very not nice way. Very improper, very rude. And so later on that night, the son confronts Ivan for talking about his wife like that. They get in an argument. Ivan's temper gets away from him, and he strikes his son in a fit of anger, murdering his son. And what you see on the screen there is a painting of Ivan cradling the corpse of his murdered son, who he had just murdered in a fit of rage. And oops, oh no, that was the only heir to the Russian throne. So when Ivan dies, there's a time period of chaos and upheaval and civil war in Russia called the Times of Trouble. And eventually, after years of fighting, the family that comes out on top would be the Romanov. right? The Romanov dynasty, created by Michael Romanov. And the Romanovs will rule Russia all the way until 1917, where the entire Russian family will be executed by communist revolutionaries, but that is for another chapter. But the Romanovs become one of the powerful, great families of Europe. And one of the greatest members of this great family is Peter the Great. Right? No pun intended there. Peter the Great, another interesting figure. All these Romanovs and these rulers of Russia, they're so complicated. Peter the Great was literally head and shoulders above the rest. He was well over 6 feet tall. Back then, the average height was about 5'5", 5'6", so he was a giant of a man. He had a horrible temper. He could be a man of violence, but he was also a man of learning himself. He loved to work hard, including with his bare hands. He had a huge palace in St. Petersburg based on Versailles, but he also built himself a cabin that he preferred to stay in. He liked to show off his calluses on his hands to dinner guests. You wouldn't see Louis showing off calluses because Louis didn't have calluses because he didn't do work like that. He learned how to build ships. He loved building ships. He became obsessed with the Navy. He's just an odd fellow. He could be at times heroic and brave and just tremendously cruel. There's even a story, and it's probably myth, that when he was growing up, when he and his fellow children would play war, soldiers, sometimes some of the children died while playing, which is probably myth, but the fact that people are willing to believe it kind of shows you his character. Like I said, an interesting fellow. So when he inherits the throne, becomes the Tsar, one of the first things he does is he leaves Russia. See, Russia, compared to the rest of Europe, was kind of viewed as a backwater, not important, and he wanted to change that. So he becomes Tsar and leaves Russia to go on a great European tour, to study the great powers like Prussia, like England, and see what makes them great. Sometimes he would travel as himself, sometimes he would travel in disguise, which never worked, by the way, because I already said he was a giant of a man for the time period. At some points, he and his fellow travelers were kind of kicked out of places because they had a tendency to trash their hotel rooms like an 80s rock star. But eventually he comes back to Europe with all these ideas, and he's going to change Europe. He's going to overhaul Russia, whether Russia wants it or not. Right? So he's going to change the military. He's going to modernize the military. You want a full-time standing military. He comes back as a big fan of absolutism, which he saw in France, right? He definitely wants to put the boyars in their place. He brings back cultural changes as well. He comes back and he noticed in Europe they do not have the big beards that the Russian boyars had. The boyars had like these long beards down to their waist, as you can see in the picture of Peter, right? They didn't have those in Europe, so he instituted a rule that all boyars had to shave their beards, and when one of them protested, he ripped the boyar's beard off his face with his bare hands. There's also stories of him shaving off boyars' beards with a rusty, dull razor until they finally got the point. You're going to have to shave. Also in Europe, their coats were waist length. In Russia, the coats usually went down their ankles. It's cold in Russia. And so he actually set up guards in front of the major cities, and if you tried to come into the city with a long coat, the guards would stop you, take out a pair of scissors, and cut your coat to waist length. He published a book of European table manners. No more using your hands at the table. No more using the tablecloth as a napkin. Right? He brought back radical ideas such as women will be allowed to socialize with the men at parties instead of being kept separate. Right? So he's really modernizing it. He wants Russia to fit in. He doesn't want Russia to be a backwater anymore. Now, one of the things he becomes obsessed with is he wants Russia to have a navy like other great powers like England. The problem is most of Russia's ports are frozen half the year. It's cold in Russia. So to solve the problem, he decides that he wants a new port. The problem is that port is owned by Sweden. Well, let's use our new army and go to war with Sweden. And it's successful. They capture this land. and they turned it into the new Russian capital of St. Petersburg. Now, much like in Versailles, this was swampland when he captured it, but through sheer force of will and the skill of his engineers, it becomes one of the great European cities, and it still is. And he orders the nobility to move there. Remember, absolutism, he's a bit of a fan. So by the time he dies, Russia is a great political power. It might not be as important as, say, France, but it is certainly a major player. It has a navy, it has a great European capital, it has a fairly large military. It matters. Hence, Peter the Great. Right? The story of his death is kind of interesting, by the way. You can stop now if you don't really care. But see, he was traveling, touring one of the shipyards. He liked to inspect the ships as they were being built, make sure that they were being built right. Sometimes he would join in, which is a surreal scene, right? You've got this giant czar of a man rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt and building a ship with these common laborers and joking with them and talking with them and using coarse language with them. It's a bit of an odd scene. I wish I could see it. And the story goes, someone in the shipyard fell in the water and started to drown because he couldn't swim. Which I know what you're thinking. That's really stupid. You work in a shipyard. A lot of people couldn't swim back then. Most sailors couldn't even swim back then. Which, yeah, I know. That's a little bit of a problem. Anyway, Peter dives in and saves the guy, this commoner. Saves him, right? How heroic, right? Very kingly in the best possible sense. And days later, Peter dies, right? And one version of the story is he dies because the water is so cold that he gets pneumonia. So he dies saving this commoner. The other version of the story is he dies days later because he has a wicked urinary tract infection. The pneumonia story sounds better, but either way, one of the last things he did was jump into the water to save this commoner. This is the same guy that would rip your beard off your face. He's an interesting guy, this Peter.